one of the issues actually that I think has been gaining more attention recently is especially regarding like things like social processing. It gets kind of messed up. Like people, they don't want to be around other people as much. They can feel, socially withdrawn, and that it can actually make the disorder worse. And so, because a lot of times, our trauma is related to something related to people, whether you're fighting a war and, you're shooting at people, or you see people who've been like beheaded or whatever, or, sexual assault, it's a lot of times interpersonal, violence of some sort.
Welcome back to another episode of the Peak Performance Life podcast. Today, I am very excited to have a very, very smart man on the line. We have Manoj Doss, Ph.D., who completed his doctorate at the University of Chicago, investigating the acute effects of psychoactive drugs on emotional episodic memory and memory distortion. He then worked as a postdoctoral scholar at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, investigating the acute and persisting effects of psychedelic drugs on cognition and brain function. He's currently a research fellow at the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Texas at Austin Dell Medical School. Manoj, thank you so much for joining us here today.
No problem. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So let's start with a little bit of a background. How did you get interested and start getting into the work that you're doing today?
Yeah. So, my background's actually in studying human episodic memory. But, one thing about when you study kind of these really like well-studied areas of cognition and brain function, like episodic memory, which has been around, as a field for, let's say, over 100 years, it can get a little pedantic. And I love the, pedantic arguments, but, sometimes it does make you feel like your work might not have much implications, at least in my lifetime. And so one way to kind of connect my work with more things that were happening, in the real world was to start studying, drugs and memory. And, it's kind of interesting, although drugs and memory has been studied for a while, it's kind of studied more from like the way that it was studied in the animal tradition. So things like conditioning, fear conditioning. So if I play this sound and shock you, and later on I play this sound again, you're going to be scared and you're going to show a certain behavioral response. But, studying like especially like human episodic memory, like what makes us feel human anyways, like going back in time, mentally time traveling, it hadn't been done super well with a lot of psychoactive drugs. So it's kind of an area that I was sort of filling with my research. And then, of course, the psychedelic boom happened, and it was kind of an opportune moment for me to, start applying some of that work to psychedelics. And so, yeah, I think that was, I think I always did have some interest in drug research for, unfortunately, probably some morbid reasons. I had a bunch of friends in high school get into drugs, and I think at the time I didn't really appreciate that. And now I think that, I think drugs are a large part of most societies, and they deserve to be studied rather than, just banned altogether.
Absolutely. They absolutely deserve to be studied. Yeah, 100%. And like you said, yeah, it's a big part of society. So we should know what we're doing, what the effects are. We should learn about this stuff.
Exactly.
So you studied alcohol, marijuana, psilocybin, MDMA. Any others that I'm missing?
I just published a study with 2CB, if you're familiar with that one.
No, I've never heard of that.
So there's a lot of obscure psychedelics out there that are, there's hundreds, thousands even at this point. But 2CB is probably the most popular obscure psychedelic. It's basically a molecule away from mescaline. And it's a really interesting drug in that it ends up having these really strong visual effects without necessarily having really strong, what is life type effects. I think there is a dose at which it will produce the really strong mystical, where am I, dissolution of the sense of self type effects. But it is a pretty interesting drug where at least at doses you can get basically LSD psilocybin visuals without the crazy other things happening. And because of that, it ends up being a drug people do use more to go out and whatnot. And so I studied that one. I studied benzodiazepines a little bit. So, triazolam, for example, Ambien, dextromethorphan. So Robitussin, if you remember robotripping from high school, people taking a bunch of cough syrup, ketamine, and I think, methamphetamine and amphetamine. So I think those are some that I've published on. So a handful of drugs. Oh, ayahuasca. We're about to have a paper published on that. Actually, I should be submitting that today. I told my co-authors I would. So
Oh,
yeah.
cool. Wow. That's definitely a hot topic, something a lot of people have been talking about. So let's start with alcohol, if you don't mind, since that's probably the biggest and most popular one out of all of them. And I heard you talk about a fascinating study about how alcohol, we probably shouldn't say this for all the alcoholics, but how it can improve your memory in a certain way. But obviously, when you're on it, it's really bad for memory. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So this is known as retrograde facilitation. And it's actually not just one study, but at this point, there's probably close to 20 studies. And it's been shown since 1980. And it's been shown with other drugs that are pharmacologically similar to alcohol, such as benzodiazepines as well as Ambien. So these are all GABA A positive allosteric modulators. So the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in your brain is GABA. And there's a couple GABA receptors. One's the GABA A receptor. And essentially these drugs, they modulate that receptor to make GABA more efficient. And so it's not that if you study on alcohol, you'll remember more. I think everybody knows if you try to study drunk, you're not going to remember anything the next day for your test. But rather, it's if you study and then get drunk immediately afterwards, and we're talking, 4 or 5 drinks in 10 minutes, or if you take an Ambien or you take a benzodiazepine, then you can actually, it'll in some ways like retroactively protect the previous, what just happened before, so that you actually get a memory enhancement. And so there's a couple reasons for this that, there's a really boring reason. And the really boring reason is, what I just alluded to is that you're preventing interference. So if I study and then I study something else, study list A and then I study list B is going to interfere with list A and it's going to make it harder for me to remember what's going on there. But if I study list A and then get drunk afterwards, nothing's going to get in, and then list A has time to kind of stabilize and, kind of like taking a nap afterwards.
Right.
So that's a really boring reason, but it doesn't totally explain why this works, because this doesn't work with cannabis. So one of the original studies in 1980 actually had people smoke a joint immediately afterwards, and it didn't retroactively enhance memory, even though cannabis is known to impair the formation or the encoding of new memories. It also doesn't work with GHB, which is a GABA B agonist and also impairs memory. It also doesn't work very well with scopolamine. Scopolamine's it's a drug that, it's a completely different hallucinogen class, but it does impair memory pretty strongly. And at least one study didn't find that it worked, but there might be a caveat there. But yeah, with alcohol, benzos, and Ambien, it does. And there was a study that actually found with Ambien, you can have people take a nap immediately afterwards. And so you can imagine then, even if you're taking a placebo or you're taking Ambien, no new information's getting in. But what they ended up showing was with Ambien, one of the neural signatures for why you might get this memory enhancement is that there's these active consolidation processes that happen, especially during sleep. So sleep spindles, and then like slow wave oscillations. And so those will actually, and then the coupling between the two. So you can actually get, essentially, if you have these slow waves, there's these sleep spindles that occur. And if they occur at the top of that slow wave, that you're more likely to see a memory enhancement. And essentially you got an improvement in, slow waves, sleep spindles, and then that coupling between the two. And that was associated with these memory enhancements. So it seems that some of these drugs, these GABA A positive allosteric modulators, might actually actively stabilize what just happened immediately before you start taking them. And so there is a really funny paper. The title is "Forget Drinking to Forget." And so the idea is like, if you have your partner breaks up with you, don't drink immediately afterwards, because you're probably going to enhance memory for that breakup. Maybe wait a few hours or something.
That's funny. That is really funny. Yeah. And I think people should also keep in mind that, if you're trying to study for a test and you have a test the next day and you did 5 shots in 10 minutes, you might not be good to go the next day, right? So your energy levels. And so while you might remember it a little bit more, it might be offset the following day by the way you feel and being groggy.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah.
The hangover is going to make you slower. Yeah, you're not going to be able to perform fast enough.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. Very interesting. Let me actually back up a second. I'm curious, what is it that I know we're looking to study psychedelics. Is there anything specifically that you're really interested in learning about and seeing? Like, what is really when you think this is the purpose of my work? What would you say that is?
Yeah, so I think, as of now, I've actually kind of moved out of memory research a little bit when I was at Hopkins and then started to move back into it near the end. And now I'm kind of tapping back into that side of my research again here at UT Austin, including doing some studies where we're not even studying psychedelics, but we did just get funding to study psychedelics and memory. And so I think the thing that's interesting that we found with psychedelics that I want to pursue further is that so there's multiple memory systems. And so I told you, I've told you about episodic memory. So remembering where and when something happened, like, okay, yesterday I actually didn't go anywhere. I stayed at work really late, but that's an episodic memory. I can tell you that I was at work till like 8 or 9 p.m. But in contrast, you have something like, for example, fear conditioning I mentioned to you, where it's just like you hear a sound that was associated with a shock. And now when you hear that sound on its own, you still have this kind of fear response. And that's not necessarily a memory that you have to be conscious of. There's people who you can't do this type of research anymore, but there was an old study way back in the day where essentially there was a doctor a neurologist, I think, that had a patient who had damage to their hippocampus, which is involved in episodic memory, presumably hippocampus, and they couldn't remember anything. And they'd be like, oh, hi, what's up? What's your name? And, and then it's like, turn away, come back and be like, oh, hi, what's up? What's your name? And so the doctor actually put a tack in his hand, and the patient shook his hand and was like, ow, what the hell, right? And the next day, the doctor meets the patient. The patient's like, oh, hi, what's your name? And then the doctor sticks his hand out, and the patient's like, I'm not going to shake your hand. It's like, why not? It's like, it's dirty, or something like that. They didn't know why, but they still had some type of weird fear response to this cue of, I'm going to shake this doctor's hand. And so that's a different memory system. There's also like things like procedural learning, like learning to like ride a bike or, play a piano or something along those lines. And then another aspect of memory that I've studied a little bit of is semantic memory. So this is knowledge for facts. Things like, knowing that George Washington is the first president of the country. Even though you don't have the episodic memory for where and when you learn that information, you know that George Washington is the first president of the country. And so one idea is that episodic memories kind of over time, what happens is you kind of extract the statistical regularities across these episodes, and then these kind of instantiate, what becomes a semantic memory. So maybe the first time, you ate a pizza, you probably had a great episodic memory for that experience. You probably, assuming you like pizza, which I feel like most people do. And then, over time, you had, many of these episodes of pizza, and you start to forget the episodic memories, but you extract the regularities, like what a pizza looks like, tastes like, smells like. And now if I were to take your hippocampus out, you would still know what a pizza is. And so this information is kind of thought to be distributed across your cortex, which is kind of like that outside folded part that you see, on a human brain. That's particularly developed in humans as well, which might also explain why I think as humans, we probably have more semantic memories than a rat, for example. And so one thing that we found was essentially that hippocampal dependent memory was impaired under psychedelics. And when I say impaired here, I mean the formation, the encoding is what we would say in memory research. So the encoding, the formation of memories is impaired, hippocampal dependent memories, which is very common. Alcohol does this, ketamine does this, THC does this. But
when you say, explain that a little bit. When you say impaired, like give an example of that. So like that means like while you're on it, you'll make up stuff that didn't really happen, or you'll just not even remember at all, or?
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I should back up a little bit and tell you there's 3 ways in which you can essentially hit somebody's memory. So if anybody ever says drug X impairs memory, I always want to know, does it impact the encoding, the formation of memories, the consolidation or the stabilization, which I mentioned alcohol can enhance the consolidation or stabilization, or does it impact your ability to retrieve memories that you previously had? And so most drugs don't tend to actually enhance or really impair your ability to retrieve memories from the past. So, if I take, a drug right now like alcohol, it probably isn't going to impair my ability to remember what I did yesterday. It is going to impair my ability to form new memories so that if you try to test my memory tomorrow, now I'm not going to be able to remember much. Same thing with THC, same thing with ketamine. And then, as I mentioned, alcohol has that relatively unique effect where it can also retroactively enhance memory. So it enhances the consolidation. And so every form of memory, essentially, whether it's conditioning or procedural learning or episodic memory or semantic memory, has these, different stages of which, the formation, the stabilization, and then the retrieval. And so in the case of something like, like alcohol, as I mentioned, or many other drugs, they impair the ability to form episodic memories. And so in some ways, you almost need your episodic memory to eventually form semantic memories, which we're talking semantic memories will form over like years. Sometimes, that's the thing, you study for a test. And it would be ideal if you could have a semantic memory for, oh yeah, like this thing happened in this year at this time. But we all know that, when people cram and then the next day they're taking their test, they're like, oh, where was that? I remember it was on the bottom of that page, blah, 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 in the textbook down there. That's more of an episodic memory. It hasn't become semanticized. And as soon as they take their test, it leaves their brain and then they never semanticize that information unless they learn it over and over and over again. So at this point, for example, my knowledge of a lot of memory research has been semanticized. When I used to take my tests in college, they were more episodic. And so what was interesting with psychedelics is all drugs that impair the formation of hippocampal dependent memories will more or less impair the formation of cortical dependent memories. And you have essentially a temporary cortical memory known as familiarity. And that over time, if you keep repeating these like familiarity-based memories, they seem to potentially turn into semantic memories. So you can think of familiarity as being this kind of knowing that something has happened without necessarily knowing where or why. And so, for example, I might see your face one day, maybe one day I see you at a conference, and I'm going to say, I feel like I've met you before. I don't remember where I met you, when I met you, what your name is. I just know that I've met you. Or sometimes, we might have watched a movie that we think we've seen before, like an M. Night Shyamalan movie. By the way, the M in his name stands for Manoj. A lot of people might not realize that. But so, and at the very end, all your friends are like, oh my God, the twist. And you're like, I couldn't have predicted and told you what was about to happen, but I wasn't surprised at the twist because I've seen this before. It's like that's having that familiarity where, okay, that's not so novel to me anymore. So what we found so all drugs is that they impair the formation of these like episodic memories and these cortical dependent familiarity based memories, which in theory could turn into a semantic memory. What we found with psychedelics, on the other hand, is that they impaired the formation of episodic memories. So I think a lot of people, might not realize it, but they might not have very detailed memories from their psychedelic experience. They might feel like they do. And as we found, the familiarity based memories got enhanced. And so it was a very like weird dissociation that actually the first time I published this was in an MDMA study. And we showed the statistics, but we said, that was probably like just due to random error, random chance, because it was kind of trending. It wasn't even like, it barely missed that 0.05. And I was like, that's probably BS. And then we saw this again with psilocybin. And then recently we just saw it again in a study with psilocybin and 2CB. And so I was like, oh my God, this is a very unique effect because every other drug very reliably, if you start cranking up that dose, you impair both forms of memory. So my thinking is that essentially that by having that kind of familiarity-based memory, this cortical dependent memory, they kind of do probably become semantic-like memories. People leave these experiences sometimes with these really strong beliefs. And the belief is essentially a semantic memory that not everybody shares. I, might believe I was born in Texas. I don't have the episodic memory for this. I can't even remember I don't think I have my birth certificate. I think my parents probably still have it. And so like, it's kind of a belief and not everybody has that. I'm pretty sure I was born in Texas, but you know what? If you were to give me some challenging information that I wasn't born in Texas, just like if you were to tell me George Washington wasn't actually the first president of the country, it'd be very hard for me to remove that from my head. I would be like, I don't think this is true. And so I think that when people leave these experiences, these psychedelic experiences, I think that essentially this familiarity-based memory or semantic memory that they're forming these like very strong kind of cortical, non-hippocampal dependent memories that might be overall for a lot of people a good thing. If you have a new belief that can kind of shatter an old one, like after 10 years of, let's say, thinking you're a terrible human being, because you have depression, it becomes like a semantic memory. You might feel that, it's a fact to you. I'm a bad human being. Or if you have PTSD, you might be like, it's a fact that the world is dangerous, And then if you have this new kind of semantic memory that can help kind of disrupt the other one, like, hey, the world's not so dangerous, or you know what, like, I am an all right person sometimes, that could be very powerful. I mean, of course, the flip side of that is that sometimes people might leave an experience and say, I am Jesus, that's probably not an adaptive memory for most people. They might then start a cult or think that they can fly or whatever. And so, I think that in some ways, I think it can be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing. And this is why we should study it, is to try to figure out how do we prevent these kind of false beliefs and how do we maybe facilitate adaptive beliefs.
Very, very interesting. And I think so many people have been hearing about psychedelics for this type of healing old trauma, that kind of thing, right? So and that's basically what you're talking about here, right? This is how it's sort of able to potentially heal trauma in some people. Now, you did mention some people going crazy on it potentially. What have you seen? What's a percentage, if you had to throw out a rough percentage out there, of like people who take psychedelics and have an amazing life-changing experience versus people who, I guess, maybe don't have a good experience, let's say?
So a lot of people don't necessarily have a good experience, especially in the clinical trials, the ones that are actually for like therapeutic purposes. So I think a lot of people might not realize this, but the doses in those clinical studies, for depression are actually extremely high. They're 25 or 30 milligrams, which is probably something along the lines of like 5 to 7 grams of mushrooms, when, perhaps your average batch of, it's hard to say these days, like what is an average batch of mushrooms. And I'm sure like cannabis, people are figuring out ways to make them more and more potent. There's that new strain penis envy, which is supposed to be like 1 gram is the equivalent of like 1/8 of normal mushrooms or something. But let's pretend your normal, whatever standard mushrooms is like 2 grams is your, maybe 2.5 grams is like a standard dose. So yeah, we're talking like double that. And so that is a lot of times what's happening in these clinical studies. And so it can be quite jarring. And then not to mention, especially a lot of clinical populations, one is that we don't always want people who have done the drugs before. So it's also a very novel, weird experience. And then they have a lot of stuff that they're going through, And so I think it's not always pleasant. There might be some moments of pleasantness, especially probably closer to the end, but especially on the come up, it's not necessarily the case that people are having a good time. However, that doesn't mean that it doesn't end up having the benefits. And so they might leave it. They might even leave it at that day or even the next day, but sometimes even like later that they'll find that there's benefits. And I think I think this is even true for like healthy people who have taken psychedelics. There's always a moment, maybe not always, but a lot of times there's a moment that just like things feel a little like off or scary or whatever, dark, But as far as like long-term, problems, it's fairly rare, at least, from what we've seen in the lab when we control for, we do have a very specialized, populations in certain ways. So we don't take people with, any history, of course, of psychosis or bipolar disorder. I'm not sure if everybody's doing this, but even first-degree relatives, so if your parent or sibling has psychosis or bipolar disorder, a lot of studies won't take you. I think when Hopkins was first doing this, they would even do second-degree relatives. So wow. I wouldn't qualify because I do have some second-degree relatives with psychosis. And so like it's like an uncle or cousin, basically. And so, yeah, it's, we take people that have, good health, like they have to have a good heart, et cetera. They have to pass a physical. And so, and then we also like make sure that they're in like a comfortable space. Like, look, you're in a hospital. There's, if anything happened, we have rescue medications that can turn off the trip. We have benzos that can reduce the anxiety. We have an emergency room if something really bad were to happen for, some reason, which it doesn't really tend to. But I think, in some ways it's like we're kind of maximizing the safety such that people are going to feel good, at least not have like terrible trips. But I mean, there are some rare cases, and it's not like, it seems that this is yet to happen in the lab. But where it seems to trigger psychosis. So I do have a friend from college that they never quite came back from, taking mushrooms. And I mean, they're fine now, but they are on antipsychotics for the rest of their life, probably. And so, and when if they've gotten off of them, it's not a good sight. Like, I'm not talking about just like delusions, like literally their grammar falls apart. And so like, it's like not so, I mean, would that have happened anyways? Like for a lot of people with schizophrenia or, bipolar disorder, whatever it is, it's not just the case that it starts with like drugs. Sometimes it's like something else, like a stressful event can trigger these sorts of things. And so would they have developed it anyways? I have no idea, but it is something we have to look out for. And then there's another thing that a lot of people might not realize, but there's been at least a handful of, I think, survey studies now that do suggest that some people will still experience some persisting effects in the days or even the weeks afterwards. And it seems to maybe be a bit more common with LSD compared to like psilocybin. Although, again, these data are relatively new and, they're small, but it seems like, people will have like, it's not necessarily like bothersome to their life, but some persisting, alterations in their perception. And then in certain rare cases, again, although definitely does happen. HPPD can happen, which is known as hallucinogen persistent perception disorder. And that can like last for even longer, where it's not just distortions, but they can even get things like they can get anxious, things can kind of suddenly start to feel like a little bit like they're tripping again in inappropriate times. And so, I don't want to say, this is why I never tell anybody to take the drugs. Like that's a very personal decision, but I think especially if you're depressed, and, this is like the last resort, you've tried everything. I mean, and, this might be, hey, the risk might be worth it for some people,
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really important that we talk about that and actually set the context, right? Because some people could be like, oh, yeah, I think I have trauma. I'm going to go out and go just do my own journey on my own. And, they're not thinking about these things, the screening that you guys are doing for other family members potentially and issues like that and being in the safe environment, right? Like, people in inner cities are tripping and running around the streets of a major city, in the middle of the night. It's a little crazy sometimes. And so I think it's very important that you just kind of mention that. I do want to talk more about obviously a lot of the benefits and things like that, but really important that we discuss that. One other last thing I'll bring up as well, specifically, I had someone very, very close to me who passed away due to ketamine addiction. And so that is something that I think different, like ayahuasca and the psilocybin and those kind of drugs, those are things where you don't hear of people doing them and then waking up the next day and be like, I'm going to do this again today, right? It's like, you do that and like, you probably don't need to do that more than maybe, a couple times a year or less, right? But there are things like ketamine, which do concern me, especially with these, stupid companies offering at-home, ketamine and just shipping things to people's houses. And, a lot of people have heard about the story recently with Matthew Perry. And I mean, I saw the last 2 years of this person's life and the pain they were in and the constant in and out of the hospital and all these things that were from the ketamine addiction. And it was really nasty. So I think there's that. If you have addictive personality as well, be very, very careful, especially with things like ketamine, because I've seen a couple people go down a really bad route. And ketamine at high doses done regularly will absolutely destroy your organs, your body. I mean, I've seen it firsthand. So
urinary tract, especially. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
So yeah, it's interesting actually. So, you brought up a couple things that are actually related that you might maybe not even have realized, but you mentioned the inner city people just doing hallucinogens out there, particularly PCP. That was kind of the one that I think that, we heard a lot about maybe in the late 90s, early 2000s. So PCP and ketamine actually are similar pharmacological drugs. So they're both NMDA antagonists. So I should say, I know that there's like a little bit of controversy. What's a psychedelic? Does ketamine count? Does salvia count? Does MDMA count? I call psychedelics anything that's a serotonin 2A agonist that's hallucinogenic. So in the case of MDMA, a lot of people might not realize this, but MDMA is actually two drugs. You have a right-handed version and a left-handed version, just like you have with ketamine. There's S-ketamine now, and then, which is approved Spravato. And then there's R-ketamine. And typically, if you get just ketamine, it's a 50-50 mixture, just like with MDMA. The R-MDMA essentially does bind to the serotonin 2A receptor somewhat weakly, but it's maybe a little bit more hallucinogenic. And, some people certainly do get slightly more, psychedelic effects with MDMA. I know that when I did an MDMA study, there was two people that seemed to get somewhat when I asked them, what do you think you got? One of them said, we would basically say like you get a stimulant, sedative, cannabinoid, or placebo. And she was like, it might be, she's like, you didn't say LSD. And I was like, it's not. I was like, it's MDMA. And she was like, oh, I usually always have a good time on MDMA. She was like, I got kind of anxious. So, MDMA is kind of that weird one where it's got stimulant effects. It's got its own kind of entactogenic and then some weak psychedelic effects. But ketamine, I call it, a dissociative. Anything that's an NMDA antagonist, I would refer to pretty much as a dissociative. So that includes ketamine, PCP, nitrous oxide, dextromethorphan, And so it does seem like so Matt Johnson one time said this, and he got some grief from some people who were big ketamine proponents, but he said that ketamine, or maybe even dissociatives more broadly, are like the heroin of the hallucinogens or something like that. And like, I'm not saying that they don't have their uses. I think some people have gotten some really good effects from ketamine, and they don't necessarily take it all the time. They might take it every few months or something. I also think that there might be a paper coming out soon that's actually showing that ketamine doesn't have as great of antidepressant effects as was made out to be. I heard some whispers about this, and it might cause a little bit of a storm. I also kind of heard that potentially, the FDA maybe regrets approving Spravato, and maybe this is why they went a little bit harder on MDMA. I have no idea. But there is something about ketamine or PCP, the way what you were saying, that there were people just taking this rampantly, and then, they would do some crazy stuff. There was an old song by Nate Dogg and this guy named Houston, who was a one-hit wonder, in part because he ended up stabbing his eye out with, a fork when he was on PCP, and, had kind of a little bit of a break. And so people take these things a lot. And that's the thing with ketamine, these people who are taking it like daily and like all day, not only does it mess up like the urinary tract, but a lot of times they show like high levels of schizotypy. And,
Yes.
It can definitely, and I would probably say
memory is gone. The memory is gone. Yeah.
Memory's particularly bad. Yeah, actually, episodic memory especially, but maybe even semantic memory as well. And
well,
so,
I guess if you do it every day and it ruins your episodic memory, then you don't remember anything eventually, right?
Right. I think for all I know, this is maybe going further than the data. I also wonder if it actually starts taking out old semantic memories as well. I think it's particularly with PCP in animals, but maybe even ketamine. I don't know about nitrous oxide and dextromethorphan, but there's what's known as like these Olney's lesions. And, they're giving these animals a lot of, NMDA antagonists. But essentially you can get these actual lesions. Like, you remember the MDMA makes your brain Swiss cheese. And it turns out it was just a bad reading of like an MRI, image, right? So that's like garbage, but it can be the case. Over loads and loads of, dosing. This is maybe even more so than what a human would take, although I'm not a specialist, and I'm sure somebody would say, actually, humans can get Olney's lesions as well. But yeah, so it's certainly the case that these drugs can have a little bit of an addictive, just exactly what you said about Matthew Perry, the amount that he was doing and every day. And, he already was somebody that clearly had some, issues with addiction. But with classic psychedelics, so, LSD, psilocybin, although people don't typically do them every day, maybe if they're at Burning Man, there are some people who will do them a lot. And, especially it seems like LSD is a little bit more, I feel like, that some people will, more than just microdosing. There's stories of people taking it like every day for like a month. And I don't know if it's totally addictive, but I don't know why anybody would do that unless they were, trying to, get away from something, or
that's what I have no
idea.
The people that I've seen, the few that I've seen, it seems like they're trying to like escape reality, right? And go into it. They're in another world. They're in another planet when they're on this stuff, and they don't think about, whatever trauma or issues or things that happened, whatever the case may be. So yeah, very, very interesting. I want to change course a little bit. Another very popular one. What have you studied about marijuana? Any, benefits, downsides, whatever?
Yeah, it's funny. I don't speak for any of my employers, whatever. I'm like generally pro, decriminalization of cannabis. I think it's probably done a lot more harm criminalizing it than legalizing it, or at least decriminalizing it. But it is kind of funny that most research I've done with cannabis doesn't really show good things. And so, it's some of it's pretty obvious. It's like, oh, wow, cannabis impairs the formation of memories. We already kind of knew that, or it impairs working memory. So working memory is like holding something in mind in this moment, my phone number is 777-7777. Okay, I got to hold this in mind. Or doing math in your head, that involves working memory. And so obviously, actually, it was a pretty funny paper that we put out. It got into a pretty decent journal. This is actually my friend Kirsten Adam, who's over at Rice University. So she's really clever, and we found a really boring effect that, THC impairs working memory. And then when she went through the literature, she found that actually 70% of studies, or maybe it was 70 or 80% of studies, don't show a working memory impairment, but everybody just cites the studies that do, because presumably most people have tried cannabis and they were like, I could not do math or hold a phone number in my head right now, right? So they go off their personal experience. We showed a really robust effect because we used a proper task. And so basically we just shat on all the other not working memory. Working memory researchers are really clever. We shat on all the cannabis researchers who didn't do the proper tasks to show that there was a working memory impairment, and then it got into a decent journal. But so one thing we found, again, this is a bad effect. I thought we were going to show a good effect. Frankly, this was something that I was like, okay, we thought that, a lot of people with PTSD, they, smoke cannabis. And perhaps one reason for that is that it might suppress these kind of traumatic memories. And so what we did was we showed people a bunch of, kind of negative stuff, like horrific images. We showed them some neutral things, and then, guy sitting on his porch, for example. And we showed some positive things like chocolate and a happy baby and things like that, right? And the horrific images are not fun. I hate sorting through these stimuli before making these tasks.
That's messed up, man. Putting horrific images in front of people on drugs.
I know. Yeah. Well, it's nothing worse than a horror movie, but yeah, I think it's certainly not as bad as a horror movie, but it's not fun. Yeah, that's for sure. I always tell people my studies are not meant to be fun, that they're meant to be understanding. Yeah, exactly. You're not going to get the lay on a couch eye shade experience. We're trying to learn something here. And so one of the things that, so what we did was we showed them a bunch of those images, and then a couple days later, we gave them THC, and then we tested their memory for these images by essentially showing we showed a label that would say, did you see a picture of a guy sitting on his porch? Did you see a happy baby? Did you see a bloody axe murder scene, etc.? And then we, while they're on THC, and what people would do is they would say they saw a bunch of things they never actually saw. And we had a confidence scale too. And they would say it with the highest level of confidence. I saw a picture of a baby dying in the ICU with really high confidence. And it's no, you didn't, And wow. This to me was a rather compelling false memory, because one way you could do this is you could just show them all the images that they see and intermix them with brand new images. And this is just known as a recognition test. So you show them the picture of the guy sitting on his porch, you show them the bloody axe murder scene, which maybe they did actually see, and then you show them the baby dying in the ICU. The problem with when you do that is that, they might turn away for a second and then come back, and then they're like, wait a minute. Does this feel familiar to me right now because I saw it 2 days ago, or because I just saw it right now and I turned away and came back? But instead we show them just the label. And so it forces them to have to create an image in their head of a baby dying in the ICU. I say that because that's literally a stimulus, one of the many, stimuli that's used in this picture set. And it's they would say it with high confidence. And so since then that effect has been replicated by other groups. And so it's this kind of effect that I think a lot of people didn't know, is that THC can essentially increase false memories when you try to retrieve things from the past. So there's
when you're on it, right? To be clear, that's when you're on it, right?
So when you're on it and trying to retrieve memories from the past, from let's say when you were sober, this is impacting retrieval, not encoding, not consolidation. Or not the formation or not the stabilization, but how you access memories. It can now distort your memory. Mm-hmm. So we did find an interesting effect that this is a really, really complicated effect that I almost don't want to go into, but sometimes it's if I say it, people are like, wait a minute, how does that work? But essentially there's an effect that we found where it is at encoding now. So when you're forming memories, there's ways in which we can show you a bunch of things that end up distorting your memory subsequently when you try to retrieve memories. So you show people a bunch of related things like the words bed, rest, and awake. And then I later on, try to test your memory. And, I say, did you see the word bed? And you'll be like, yeah. Did you see the word ketchup? You'll be like, no. Did you see the word sleep? And you'll be like, yeah. And I was like, no, you didn't, And so there's this is a much more complicated false memory task. But essentially we showed under certain conditions that THC can massively distort your memory. So it'll kind of amalgamate all this information in a way that creates these really strong false memories when you're sober 2 days later. But it can also totally abolish that effect depending on certain conditions. So in other words, you'll have less false memories potentially from the way you encode information than if you were sober. So that was kind of a cool effect, and it's really complicated. So it's like never going to get cited. But it is like, oh, wow, this is probably a really unique effect of THC, although I'd like to test it with other drugs, but, don't have time to do everything. Yeah.
Let me ask you this. Of everything that you've studied so far, of all the different substances, which one do you think shows the most promise in terms of, I guess, just overall benefits? I mean, is the biggest benefit really healing past trauma? I guess that's a huge benefit for like a lot of people, right? And then, which one do you think shows the most promise, and in which way?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think definitely the classic, the psychedelics, the serotonin 2A, hallucinogenic serotonin 2A agonists, probably particularly psilocybin, because it's studied the most at this point for treating people. And it doesn't last like 12 hours like LSD. I'm assuming some of those crazy, where am I in life, type thoughts are probably beneficial. So probably better than presumably 2CB. But, and not just trauma, but I think, for example, people with depression, you get kind of stuck in certain ways. As I said, you can it's part of who you are. It's part of your belief system sometimes that like, this is life and the only way life can be. Everything sucks. And, everything's just kind of like the same every day. People don't even appreciate that, hey, look, avocados are on sale today. It's like they're just going to the grocery store again, And so I think that, these drugs can potentially kind of shatter these like belief systems, or maybe not shatter. I think that's a little strong, but they can, kind of restructure things, maybe even restructure familiar things in a novel fashion. I think this is also potentially, which is what we're actually doing for this project, where we're kind of further studying these memory processes. We're actually kind of looking at this not just because they could be therapeutic, but also because restructuring familiar things in a novel fashion could lead to things like insights, creative breakthroughs outside of even the clinic. And so, I'm not saying that like, oh yeah, take LSD or psilocybin and you're going to become the best person at your job, But there are these kind of situations that people have claimed that like they've found a breakthrough. So, the DNA, double helix structure, supposedly Crick, maybe Watson as well, they were on, psychedelics, like PCR, so the polymerase chain reaction. Kerry Mullis, is that his name? Kerry Mullis. He supposedly, he said he was on LSD, and his quote was that, would I have come up with this had I not been on LSD? Probably not, something like that, which, it's hard for me to say, like, I came up with an idea one time that turned into a pretty cool paper while I was like relaxed in the shower. Would I have come up with that outside of being relaxed in the shower? I don't know, but maybe, it's kind of hard to say. But like, there's the guy who's actually part of this. So Bruce Damer, he's running this now like this new like foundation called Minds, which is for the multidisciplinary investigations into novel discoveries and solutions. It's really long. But the idea is that he came out of the psychedelic closet recently. So he's an astrobiologist and came up with a new theory for the origins of life. And he was apparently on psychedelics. And I know that sounds like out there, and I'm one of the first people to like question like, I'm not, if I'm being honest, I'm not a very magical thinking person. I don't really have very strong or any sort of spiritual beliefs of any sort. Pretty materialist kind of in that way, which, some people say is boring, but I think it actually makes life more interesting. But I think that like Bruce, though, he, came up with this idea, and it's not so far out there. Essentially, most people would agree, like, okay, life started, it needed water, bottom of the ocean, it needed water and heat, bottom of the ocean, where those like thermal vents are, right? The problem is with that is that at least to create protocells, a lot of times you need periods of like wet and dry, and it's always wet at the bottom of the ocean. The other problem is that, if you don't have, these protocells don't have pumps to like pump out things like salt, and the bottom of the ocean, it's all salt. So, the cells will like explode or something. So I'm probably not doing justice to what Bruce's work suggests, but whatever. I'm not an astrobiologist or a cellular biologist, but essentially he came to this realization, and it was more than just like, oh my God, where's another place that could happen? Hot springs. But then like all the events that could happen in hot springs kind of came together, where it was like, holy shit, like this might actually be a real thing. And then now it's like actually one of the like leading theories of where the origins of life started. Like this was on the cover of Scientific American. It got published in, a field-specific astrobiology journal. And, years later, more recently, basically, he was like, by the way, I was on psychedelics when I came up with that. And so he started this foundation to try to, want to like look at how can we use psychedelics as well as other, techniques for kind of these creative breakthroughs. And, I think it's really cool that, he didn't just come up with something bizarre. Like sometimes people will come out of these psychedelic experiences. They're not like physicists and they'll say, I know the origins of the universe, or I now understand consciousness. And it's like, all right, tell me, what it is. And it's like, if they actually, it's like, where's your Nobel Prize, bro? Because if you actually understood this, like you would have that by now. And so, but I think what Bruce basically did was he shuffled around familiar pieces of information in a novel fashion. And that's how he kind of came to his conclusions. So I think that's something psychedelics might be able to do, this restructuring sort of semantic memory that can both be therapeutic as well as could lead to things like creative breakthroughs potentially.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very interesting. I mean, it makes sense. You're, in layman's term, tapping into a different part of your brain, or, accessing through different pathways or whatever the case may be. What about for trauma, I guess, MDMA? Because MDMA, doesn't it it's interesting because psilocybin doesn't necessarily make you love everyone, right? But when you're on MDMA, you're like, I love you, whatever. I mean, I don't know, this from most people from what I've seen and heard, are getting that kind of feeling. Have you found that that's effective, or you're seeing psilocybin more effective in people who are overcoming trauma, whether it be PTSD with veterans or people who experienced trauma when they were younger?
Yeah, so I think with actual PTSD and your prototypical psychedelics psilocybin or LSD, I think the study is it'll probably be coming out soon, but I think Compass Pathways is working on that. But there actually hasn't been a controlled study yet with, where it was focused on PTSD. I think there was a small study with maybe it was depression and, they had some of them had PTSD. I think there's a little bit of a fear. I know at Hopkins, they were a little what if it triggers a flashback? Like people have a full out, reliving of their trauma while they're under the effects of the drug. And then, in certain cases, if they could get violent or whatever, it could turn bad. And in fact, I do know that there was a case where somebody had it wasn't for a PTSD study, but they did have a kind of a reliving of their sexual abuse. And apparently they didn't want to have anything to do with the study anymore. And, it wasn't a good time for them. And they basically just lost contact with everyone. So, I think there was a little bit of fear. It does sound like, I haven't seen any data, but it does sound like, I think psilocybin is probably going to work for PTSD. And then certainly you hear these stories of people, for example, veterans, going to do these ayahuasca ceremonies, which are, ayahuasca DMT is very, very similar. It's minus a 4-hydroxy group, basically. 4-hydroxy DMT is psilocin, which is the active metabolite of psilocybin. And so, there might be a little bit more potentially, there might be, more chances of reliving something like that under the effects of a drug like that. Whereas MDMA, it does seem to, oddly enough, despite having these stimulant effects, and a lot of stimulants can produce anxiety, it oddly seems to have a weird calming effect too. People seem to be less afraid of, I heard a friend one time talking about what was it? It was something like that. It was maybe one of the first several times of taking MDMA, and rave bathrooms are absolutely disgusting. And they were like, I wasn't so disgusted by the toilets in the rave bathroom.
Right.
And so which I, by the way, very much empathize with, club bathrooms are so disgusting. I have a weird phobia of that. And so, so anyways, I think that there's something to that, but yeah, I don't know, for example, are the stimulant effects of MDMA necessary to produce that effect? You don't necessarily get very strong stimulant effects with things like psilocybin. LSD maybe a little bit more. It has some binding to dopamine receptors, but it doesn't directly release dopamine the way that MDMA does or amphetamine can. And so I don't know if that effect is necessary. There's actually certain drugs that are pretty selective for releasing serotonin without impacting dopamine and norepinephrine too much. And I wonder if those would work. Although people will say that they're like, I've heard basically that those drugs aren't as fun, but part of that fun is that they don't produce that same level of empathy and love, that they're kind of a little drunken apparently. But I don't know. One thing
I've
that
heard of
we
a
just
lot of
actually,
people for couples. I've heard of a lot of couples recently doing MDMA therapy and people saying that it saved their marriage and things like that. It
oh yeah.
seems there's something there where it's bringing people closer together, especially people who were, maybe once in love or still in love, but having issues or whatever the case may be. Have you seen any of that?
So
Yeah.
yeah, so actually something worth mentioning about PTSD. So, obviously I'm fixated on the memory component and whatever as a
Yeah.
memory
Yeah.
researcher, but PTSD is like multifaceted. One of the issues actually that I think has been gaining more attention recently is especially regarding like things like social processing. It gets kind of messed up. Like people, they don't want to be around other people as much. They can feel, socially withdrawn, and that it can actually make the disorder worse. And so, because a lot of times, our trauma is related to something related to people, whether you're fighting a war and, you're shooting at people, or you see people who've been like beheaded or whatever, or, sexual assault, it's a lot of times interpersonal, violence of some sort. And so, that MDMA, that might be one reason why MDMA might be particularly good, is its social effects that, these other, psilocybin, LSD, I think they can produce at certain points like this massive amounts of love, but it's, it seems to be more variable. And they certainly don't produce the same degree of like social interaction that wanting to socialize. People struggle to even bring words to their mouth sometimes under the effects of, those types of drugs. Whereas with MDMA, even though they kind of, a lot of times with MDMA therapy, they start in the same way as psilocybin therapy. So there's really no psychotherapy involved in psychedelic psilocybin therapy. You just lay on a couch with eye shades on and listen to music. And with MDMA, on the other hand, a lot of them start that way, but people feel compelled to want to start talking. And, this was something that, I know that the recent like rejection of MDMA, one of the critiques was that, well, there wasn't like some type of standardized therapy. But it seems like, they did kind of, people just kind of spontaneously, a lot of them wanted to talk about their trauma. They're there for that purpose, and they probably start thinking about it because that's what they're there for, is to try to, heal this. And they kind of just do. And so, we actually, by the way, last night just had a paper that was accepted. You'll see this coming out soon. But what we actually found was this is true with MDMA as well as with classic psychedelics, but kind of across several, I think we found 25 studies, mostly in animals, but this kind of process is similar to what might happen in humans, at least to some degree. So it's what's known as extinction learning. So this is like another form of memory. It's actually not the same thing it's not just the same thing as undoing conditioning. It's like building a memory on top of conditioning that suppresses a conditioned fear memory. So I will play a sound and associate it with a shock. And then, later on you hear that sound and you're scared. What you can do is you can keep playing that sound over and over and over again. And what that can eventually do is you're going to like extinguish that fear memory. And the problem is that it's usually this extinction memory isn't as strong as your initial conditioned fear. So a lot of your conditioned fear will come back. Like, for example, if I, now play the sound, like I played the sound a million times in this room and now you're not scared of it anymore. But if I take you outside and play that sound again, your skin conductance response, your fear response will come back again, which, you can imagine a lot of times with people with PTSD, okay, they'll do like exposure therapy in their doctor's office. As soon as they leave, so exposure therapy with something like, imagining their, trauma, or maybe even the doctor might present certain cues related to their trauma, like visual cues, or play certain sounds or whatever. As soon as they leave their doctor's office, they're scared again, And so one thing that we found, by looking through the literature, so across these like 25 studies, was that psychedelics seem to enhance extinction learning. And by enhancing, it seems to, first of all, reduce that fear response faster. It seems to be more sustained, so for a longer period of time. It also might be context independent. And the one reason we think this might be is that the hippocampus, as I mentioned about episodic memory, is involved in contextualizing all kinds of different information. It produces a context which can help facilitate certain types of learning and also certain responses in the appropriate context. But in this case, having an extinction memory that's context dependent is actually not as useful. I mean, sure, if you're in a war zone, you should know to be afraid of certain sounds, obviously, but when you go to the beach and you see the sand, And that shouldn't remind you of sand in the desert that's associated with the war that you fought, And so this is essentially, what we think is that it might be actually removing. So the hippocampus actually expresses some serotonin 2A receptors, but they're on inhibitory neurons, whereas in the cortex, they seem to be more on excitatory neurons. So you might be inhibiting the hippocampus while still driving certain, cortical processing. And this can result in learning that, okay, stop being afraid of this thing in a context like independent manner. So anyways, I think that potentially MDMA is better at that. Who knows? But I think kind of across the board, we'll find that maybe with psychedelics, like we should maybe be combining something like exposure therapy with psychedelics, maybe especially MDMA, because, it could be very jarring to have somebody remember their trauma on like a proper psychedelic. But at least with MDMA, it, seems to be that like, hey, people are better able to tolerate this and that they kind of spontaneously relive it anyways, even though you might not even be trying to get them to, and perhaps even encouraging them to could, in theory, kind of extinguish this fear memory.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Manoj, this has been absolutely fascinating. I'm sure everyone listening right now is just blown away. And where can people follow you, learn more?
So my Twitter is at Manoj Doss, MANOJDOSS, or X, I guess that's called these days. And so that's like a lot of times where you'll find where I'll post my research, especially, and I try to gear it towards not just scientists. Sometimes it'll be very sciencey, but I try to make sure other people, can have some access to it. That's also where I'll post, whatever. I'll probably post this. If, you put it online, I'll put it out there on there. I also have a lot of hot takes on there sometimes where I don't sometimes appreciate, the way that the media might blow up certain types of research, or even certain researchers, the way they might, talk about their research. And I'm happy to also get critiques about my own. I wish more people would do that so that I could check myself sometimes, And then I guess, there's that. And then, I'm on the, Dell Medical School, UT Austin website. You can find me there.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. And hope we can do it again soon.
Yeah, this was really great. I had a good conversation, man.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, can you please leave us a rating or review and subscribe? I've realized that while we have actually increased our downloads a lot, we're actually getting a lot of downloads, which I'm really happy about. We actually have very few ratings. And I realized that I've never asked people really to rate much. So I'm asking you now if you could please rate and review and subscribe. And if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to anyone that you think will get value out of this. Also, if you haven't checked out our line of products at buypeakperformance.com, you get 20% off your first order. That's www.buypeakperformance.com. We have some incredible products, including our organic high-altitude coffee. If you don't know this, coffee is one of the most heavily sprayed with pesticides out of any crop. So it's really important that you drink organic coffee. We've gone above and beyond to source what we believe is the highest quality and healthiest organic coffee in the world. We're also famous for our organic green superfood powder. You can get 20% off of that as well at buypeakperformance.com. We also have an organic vegan and paleo plant protein. See, most of the vegan proteins out there are using brown rice protein, which is really not a good source of protein, and it's also a grain. And if you're paleo, you know that grains tend to cause inflammation in some cases for some people. And so we wanted to make one that was paleo friendly and vegan and organic. We made an amazing amino acid profile, so it's really one of the best plant proteins for muscle building. So you can check out Peak Performance Organic Plant Protein. You can find that on our website. Of course, all our products are on Amazon as well. So thanks again. And again, please, if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to someone who you feel can get value out of it. And please leave us a rating, review, and subscribe. Thank you.